500 individuals with known extremist connections have travelled to Syria and Iraq from the UK since the start of the conflict. Over half have returned. This clearly poses a threat to the UK and is a significant challenge for the British government. I am delighted, therefore, to welcome the Home Secretary to RUSI to speak on the subject of counter-terrorism and security. The Home Secretary has been in position since 2010, and I'm delighted to welcome her back to the Institute today. Home Secretary.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Charlie. Since I became Home Secretary 4.5 years ago, I've been briefed about many hundreds of terror suspects intent on attacking Britain, the British people and our interests overseas. The Security Service believes that since the attacks on the 7th of July 2005, around 40 terrorist plots have been disrupted. There have been attempts to conduct marauding Mumbai-style gun attacks on our streets, blow up the London Stock Exchange, bring down airliners, assassinate a British ambassador, and murder serving members of our armed forces. Almost all of these attacks have been prevented by the first-class men and women of our security and intelligence services, the police, and our allies overseas. But as the IRA once boasted, the terrorists only have to be lucky once. And last year, drummer Lee Rigby was murdered in broad daylight by Islamist extremists in London, while Mohammed Salim, an 82-year-old British Muslim from Birmingham, was murdered by a Ukrainian far-right extremist who then tried to bomb mosques in Walsall, Wolverhampton and Tipton. The terrorists who committed these cowardly acts are now where they belong, behind bars, serving life sentences. But since the attacks they carried out, the threat we face from terrorism has grown more serious. This summer, JTAC, the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, raised the threat level for international terrorism from substantial to severe. This means that JTAC believes an attack on the United Kingdom is highly likely. The decision to change the threat level was based primarily on developments in Syria and Iraq, where the terrorist group ISIL controls swathes of territory. We believe, as Charlie said, that more than 500 British nationals have travelled to Syria and Iraq, many of them to fight. And they've been joined by people now totalling thousands from other European and Western countries. ISIL and its Western fighters now represent one of the most serious terrorist threats we face. They have shown their brutality by murdering, raping and torturing men, women and children in the territories they hold, and by murdering Western hostages, including British citizens, in the most savage way imaginable. One of their terrorists has already struck in Europe, when earlier this year he murdered 4 civilians outside the Jewish Museum in Brussels. And ISIL have made no secret of their desire to bring death and destruction to the United Kingdom, the United States, and to other Western countries. Unlike other terrorist organisations, ISIL have the ambition to become a state in their own right, with all the financial clout and the military and technological possibilities statehood brings. They occupy around 1/3 of the combined territories of Syria and Iraq, a landmass almost the same size as Great Britain. And their geographical location means that they are just a few hours flying time away from our country. Their sophisticated use of the internet and social media means they have a significant propaganda reach right across the world. And there is evidence that as well as inspiring many young Muslims to travel to Syria and Iraq to fight, they have given energy and a renewed sense of purpose to subversive Islamist organisations and radical leaders in Britain. So the threat ISIL presents to us is clear and it is serious. But it is not the only threat we face. There is Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in Yemen, related organisations in Libya, Al-Shabaab in East Africa, terrorists planning attacks from Pakistan and Afghanistan, and homegrown extremists who've been radicalised here in Britain. The threat is diverse, and partly because of events on the ground across the Middle East, it is changing rapidly. As I said in a speech here at RUSI in 2011, at the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring, change for the better is not inevitable. There is a chance that the Arab Spring does not bloom, that new repressive regimes replace old ones, that they give way to new and more dangerous regimes, or that terrorists gain the space and power that they lacked under the autocratic regimes of the past. Unfortunately, that cautious warning has been proved right. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula operates within what is effectively a safe haven in parts of Yemen. Libya has not become more stable since the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi, but less stable and more violent. Syria and Iraq have become the crucible of terror and violence in which groups such as al-Nusra Front and ISIL operate. Away from the Middle East, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb has become more confident, using the capabilities it has developed through kidnap ransoms and weaponry seized in Libya. Al-Shabaab has become more daring, most notably in its attack on the Westgate shopping mall in Nairobi and the cold-blooded murder of bus passengers in northern Kenya. And Boko Haram has grown in size, strength, and the extent of the territory it controls. Some of these organisations may sound remote and distant, but each one of them has ambitions to strike at our citizens and our interests, and each represents a real threat to our national security. As Home Secretary, I'm responsible for government policy on crime, policing, immigration and border control, but by far the most important of my responsibilities relates to counter-terrorism. This is actually the most intensive and time-consuming part of the job, yet for obvious reasons it is also the least well-known and least understood. Almost every day I receive an intelligence briefing prepared for me by security officials that details threats to the UK and our efforts to counter them. On a typical day, I spend considerable time carefully considering the necessity and proportionality of applications for warrants related to national security and serious crime. These are applications made by the Security Service, the National Crime Agency and the police to use interception and intrusive surveillance techniques to gain vital intelligence in the highest priority operations. Each week I have a meeting in which I'm briefed by the Security Service and, because they head up national counter-terrorism policing, the Metropolitan Police. This meeting is usually with the Director General of MI5 and the Met's Assistant Commissioner for Counter-Terrorism. And we cover a range of operational, legal and policy issues relating to the most serious terrorist threats we face. I also chair the weekly security meeting, in which I review the work we're doing to protect the public from the risk of a terrorist attack. Around the table at the weekly security meeting sit representatives from MI5, MI6, GCHQ, JTAC, the Metropolitan Police, the Office for Security and Counter-Terrorism, Border Force, and organisations like the National Offender Management Service. Government departments that play their part in delivering our counter-terrorism strategy, including the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defence, the Cabinet Office, the Treasury, the Northern Ireland Office, and the Departments of Education, Communities and Local Government, International Development, and Transport all attend too. The reason I'm providing these details is that they illustrate the amount of time and effort devoted to counter-terrorism in government, and they show how many organisations need to be involved to deal with such a complex threat. There are threats from around the world and threats originating at home, threats to British interests overseas and threats right here on our streets. Threats that relate not just to Islamist extremism, although that is by far the most dangerous, but from the far right, Northern Ireland-related terrorism, and others. Plots that aim to kill hundreds and even thousands of people, and plots that target specific victims because of who they are and what they stand for. Plots that try to wreak enormous damage on our economy. Cyber threats from hostile foreign states and from terrorist organisations. Radicalisation taking place behind closed doors, in mosques, homes and community centres, but also in schools, universities and prisons. hateful radicalising propaganda disseminated in full view online and via social media, and serious attack planning conducted online, too often protected by everyday technology from the watchful eyes of the intelligence agencies. So this is a struggle that is being fought on many fronts and in many forms. And we therefore need a counter-terrorism strategy that is comprehensive and coherent. The strategy we inherited from the last government was, as I have said many times before, broadly sound. On coming to power, we conducted a review of counter-terrorism powers, and while we made some specific policy changes, the fundamental strategy stayed in place. Despite the debt crisis, we protected the budgets for counter-terrorism policing and for the security and intelligence agencies. We reduced the legal limit for pre-charge detention from 28 to 14 days, and we replaced control orders, which had been whittled down by the courts, with TPIMs, the Terrorism Prevention and Investigation Measures. Our biggest criticism of the last government's policy was that it had not done enough to counter the wider extremism, often not violent in its nature, that we believe is indelibly linked to the violence and terrorism that threatens us. We therefore reformed the prevent pillar of the counter-terrorism strategy significantly. We separated prevent work from the integration work that is led by the Department for Communities and Local Government. We made sure it would tackle all forms of terrorism, not just Islamist-related terrorism. We introduced new procedures to make sure we only work with organisations that respect British values and public funding does not find its way to extremist organisations. Most importantly, we changed Prevent's objectives so it deals with non-violent extremism as well as violent extremism. We always said we would keep our terrorism laws and capabilities under review, so we are able to respond to events, new emerging threats and different methods used by our enemies. We learned from the 7/7 inquest the need for much better interoperability between the emergency services. We learned too from the marauding attacks in Mumbai in 2008. We responded to the murder of Lee Rigby by setting up the Prime Minister's Extremism Task Force, and there will no doubt be important lessons in the report by the Intelligence and Security Committee about Lee Rigby's murder, which will be published very soon. We have worked hard to make it easier to get rid of foreign nationals, including terrorists and terror suspects who should not be in this country. We've changed the law to make clear to the courts that Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the right to a family life, is a qualified and not an absolute right. We've changed the law to reduce the number of appeal rights in immigration law from 17 down to 4. And we now have 6 deportation with assurance agreements with countries including Jordan and Morocco, so we can deport people in line with our human rights obligations. We have legislated through the Justice and Security Act to allow the use of closed material procedures in some civil cases, so the courts can provide justice where sensitive information relating to national security is central to the case. We made sure, even as we opted out of more than 130 European measures, that we signed up to measures like SIS-2 or the second-generation Schengen Information System, which will allow us to track foreign fighters and terror suspects. We have legislated to deprive nationalised Britons of their citizenship when we believe they can acquire another nationality. In the Serious Crime Bill, we are making it a criminal offence to prepare and train for terrorism abroad. And we are continuing our work that will lead to the introduction of exit checks at the border by April next year. This summer, we also changed the law with cross-party support to deal with 2 urgent priorities and problems relating to communications data and interception. When the European Court of Justice called into question the legal basis upon which we require communication service providers to retain data, and when providers based overseas questioned the application of our laws on interception to them, we legislated to put both questions beyond doubt. I'm not going to pretend that it has all been plain sailing. As Home Secretary, I have, almost from day one, made the case for the police and security services to be given full access to the communications data they need to keep us safe. For years, they've had access to this data, the who, where, when and how of a communication, but not its content. And it has played a significant role in every major security service counter-terrorism operation in the last decade. But because the way in which we communicate is increasingly online, the ability of the authorities to obtain the data they need is declining rapidly. Unfortunately, there is no agreement in the coalition, or for that matter with the opposition, about the need for the Communications Data Bill, and so we're going to have to wait until after the general election to address fully this increasingly urgent problem. But I remain passionately convinced that our national security, not to mention our ability to fight back against organised crime groups and networks of child abusers, means we need this bill. But despite this difficulty, we have built on the broadly sound strategy we inherited from the last government, and we have a strong record when it comes to giving the police and security services the powers and resources they need to keep us safe. To put things into perspective, I will tell you about the range of actions that the authorities have taken since May 2010. I've already said that in this period our country has faced numerous terrorist plots, but since April 2010, 753 people have been arrested for terrorism-related offences. 212 have been charged and 148 have been successfully prosecuted. 138 people are behind bars serving sentences for terrorism-related offences. 13 people, including Abu Hamza, have been extradited after being accused or convicted of terrorism-related offences. And we've also made sure that a number of dangerous people, including Abu Qatada, have been removed from this country because of the terrorist threat they posed. Since the start of this government, the Counter-Terrorism Internet Referral Unit has secured the removal of 65,000 items from the Internet that encouraged or glorified acts of terrorism. More than 46,000 of these have been removed since December last year. At present, content relating to ISIL, Syria and Iraq represents around 70% of the unit's caseload. Since I became Home Secretary, I have excluded hundreds of people in total from Britain. I've excluded 61 people on national security grounds and 72 people because their presence here would not have been conducive to the public good. In total, I've excluded 84 hate preachers. 74 organisations are at present proscribed because they are engaged in or support terrorism. Since May 2010, I've revoked the British citizenship of 27 people because their activities were not conducive to the public good, the overwhelming majority because of terrorist activities. And since I updated the criteria for using the royal prerogative in April 2013, I've refused or cancelled 29 passports to disrupt the travel of people planning to engage in terrorist-related activity overseas. This is the scale of the threat we face and the scale of the work the authorities do every single day to keep the public safe. So when the security and intelligence agencies tell us that the threat we face is now more dangerous than at any time before or since 9/11, we should take notice. And after careful analysis and thorough preparation, where we can tighten our laws and toughen the powers and capabilities available to us, we should. I can therefore confirm, as the Prime Minister first announced this summer, the government will on Wednesday introduce a new counter-terrorism and security bill. In common with all the work the government has done since May 2010, this legislation will seek to build on our existing counter-terrorism strategy. The new powers will help us to prevent radicalisation, strengthen the TPIMS regime, give us greater powers to disrupt and control the movements of people who go abroad to fight, improve our border security, make sure British companies are not inadvertently funding ransom payments, close down at least part of the communications data capability gap, and establish a new independent privacy and civil liberties board. First, on radicalisation. I've already explained how we've reformed the PREVENT programme, but as I've said before, there is always more to do and we need to go further. So we will legislate to put Channel, the existing successful programme for people at risk of radicalisation, on a statutory basis to improve the consistency of its delivery and ensure the participation of all the appropriate organisations. We will also place a statutory duty on named organisations, such as schools, colleges, universities, the police, prisons, probation providers and local government, to help prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. So, for example, universities will have to put in place extremist speaker policies, and prisons will have to show they are dealing with extremist prisoners in an appropriate way. The organisations subject to the duty will have to take into account guidance issued by the Home Secretary. Where organisations consistently fail, ministers will be able to issue directions to them, which will be enforceable by court order. The bill will also strengthen the TPIM regime. TPIMs give the police and security services strong legal powers to disrupt and restrict the movements of terror suspects and their contact with named associates when we cannot disclose sensitive intelligence material in an open court, or if they're a foreign national we're unable to deport. They enable the authorities to limit a subject's access to telephones and the internet, prevent them meeting certain associates, compel them to stay at a named address for a set number of hours every day, and bar them from entering certain premises or neighbourhoods. The overall package, which in addition to these legal powers gave the police and security service tens of millions of pounds for increased surveillance and investigation, remains sound. But in response to the increased threat we face, and in response to the police and security services telling us this is what they need, we will legislate to allow TPIM subjects to be relocated to different parts of the country. At the same time, we will accept the recommendation made by David Anderson, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, that the burden of proof for TPIM should be raised from reasonable belief to the balance of probabilities. This is in line with the civil standard of proof, and our analysis shows that every single TPIM issued so far would have passed this threshold. The bill will give the authorities greater powers to disrupt and control the movements of people who want to travel abroad to fight. The police and designated border force officers acting on the directions of the police will have the power to seize somebody's travel documents, which includes tickets as well as passports, at the border for up to 30 days if they have reasonable suspicion that a person plans to leave the UK for the purpose of engaging in terrorism-related activities. This power will apply to British passports and foreign passports, and to British citizens and foreign nationals, and it will give the authorities time to investigate the suspect and assess whether they need to take further action. In addition to these new powers to stop people leaving the country, the bill will create a statutory temporary exclusion order to control the return to the UK of a British citizen suspected of involvement in terrorism-related activity abroad. These orders will be enforced through the cancellation of travel documents and the inclusion of the individual's details on our watch lists, including the no-fly list. So the message to British nationals participating in terrorism overseas is clear. You will only be allowed to come home on our terms. We are also taking the opportunity to toughen our arrangements for aviation security. This means requiring airlines to provide passenger data more effectively, changing the law to extend our no-fly list, and strengthening our ability to impose security and screening requirements on travel to the UK. If our airlines do not give us passenger information or comply with our security screening rules, we will ensure they cannot fly to the United Kingdom. To put an end to uncertainty about insurance and reinsurance payments for kidnap and ransom, and to help prevent an important element of terrorist financing, the bill will amend existing law to make sure UK-based insurance firms do not provide cover for the payment of terrorist ransoms. To put this important issue into context, along with oil sales, taxation and extortion, the UN estimates that ransom payments raised up to £28 million for ISIL in the last 12 months alone. A new offence will apply to ransom payments once the bill is introduced. As I've already said, I remain passionately convinced of the need to address the capabilities gap the authorities face when it comes to communications data, and I'm pleased to say that the bill will go some way to bridging that gap. It will therefore require internet providers to retain Internet Protocol or IP address data to identify individual users of internet services. This is an important step and it builds on the emergency legislation in the summer. But I must emphasise that these powers are limited and they do not mandate the retention of and access to data that would in all cases identify a suspect who has, for example, been accessing servers hosting illegal content. The progress in this bill is welcome, but we will still need to return to the Communications Data Bill in the next Parliament. The powers in the Counter-Terrorism and Security Bill are essential to keep up with the very serious and rapidly changing threats we face. But it is also right that we make sure there is proper oversight and scrutiny of those who use the sensitive powers granted by counter-terrorism legislation. That is why we have already acted in this Parliament to strengthen the role and increase the resources available to the Intelligence and Security Committee. And it is why the bill will also establish a new independent Privacy and Civil Liberties Board to support the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, David Anderson, QC. This legislation is important. The substance is right, the time is right, and the way in which it has been developed is right. It is not a knee-jerk response to a sudden perceived threat. It is a properly considered, thought-through set of proposals that will help to keep us safe at a time of very significant danger. It builds on a successful strategy. It goes with the grain of existing policy. It has been drawn up in close consultation with the police and security services. It is deliberately focused on practical measures that we can be confident will work, and it broadly commands cross-party support. In an open and free society like ours, we can never entirely eliminate the threat from terrorism. But we must do everything possible, consistent with our values as a country, to reduce the risk presented by our enemies. The government's policy, our counter-terrorism strategy, and this legislation all aim to do just that. We are engaged in a struggle that is fought on many fronts and in many forms. It is a struggle that will go on for many years. And the threat we face right now is perhaps greater than it ever has been. And we must have the powers we need to defend ourselves.
Good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have some time for questions. So I'll take the gentleman here first, please.
Thank you very much. Home Secretary Andy Bell, Channel 5 News. Seeing what you see come across your desk, talking to people, as you say, every week, is your message to the British people that they really have to accept that some sort of terrorist attack will happen sooner or later?
Well, as I mentioned in my speech, and as you will know, the increase in the national threat level that JTAC brought about earlier in the year, in August, has taken the threat level from substantial, where that is a threat is a strong possibility, to severe, where where an attack is highly likely. And that's the basis against which we are now operating. But I've also indicated, I think, that the threat that we face is greater now than it has been at any time before or since the attacks in the United States on 9/11. And I think it is imperative that we ensure as government that our security services and our police have the capabilities they need to deal with that threat.
Good. I've got a question here and a question here. Let's go to the gentleman here first.
Hello, Rohit Khatri from ITV News. We spoke to a British fighter who had just returned from Syria last week, who said the counter-terrorism proposals would actually radicalise a whole new generation of jihadists from the UK. Is that something you've considered? Is it possible that actually, rather than making Britain safer, these measures might increase the threat to the UK?
No, I think that these are measures that are necessary to deal with the threat that we face. In relation to radicalisation, I think there is obviously work that we are doing in terms of looking at the wider issues of extremism. But it is the case that Syria and increasingly, obviously, with the rise of ISIL, Iraq, are proving to be a huge attraction to people from the UK and from across the world in terms of travelling overseas. It's not a new phenomenon for people to travel from the UK or elsewhere to parts of the world to fight or to train. We've seen it for people going to Somalia, going to the Fatah, going to other parts of the world too. What is different now is the numbers of people who are being attracted to go, the extent to which what is happening in Syria is proving that attraction for potential jihadists. And it is what is also significant is the brutality that we have seen from ISIL, and I think many people will be shocked at the thought that young people from here in the UK do actively want to go out and join these organisations, and they're joining a variety of organisations, of course, and fight there. But in terms of the legislation, I think this is what we need to do to ensure that our security forces and our police have the powers that they need to be able to deal with the threat.
Good, thank you. Dr. Isle, International Director at the Institute.
I appreciate, Home Secretary, that it may be too early and you may have to explain it in greater detail to Parliament, but a technical question. A British subject, born British subject, with no ability or access to any other citizenship, how are you going to physically prevent him or her from returning to the UK, or, to quote you, returning only on our terms? Is it going to be a Crown prerogative that is going to do it? Is it going to be simply the cancellation of a passport, which should not prevent him from returning to the UK? What are they expected to do? A re-education programme before they land in the UK? How's it going to work?
Well, I think the details of how it will work obviously will become clearer when we actually publish the legislation. But the idea is to ensure that the individual who is returning, that return can be managed. And that will be done by looking at the issue of putting them on the sort of watch list and no-fly list and so forth to prevent their being carried into the UK, but working obviously with authorities generally, where necessary, to ensure that return is managed back to the UK. And on a case-by-case basis, that may lead to some requirements in terms of the sort of programmes that people might be going into. But it will be on a case-by-case basis, so one can't on a blanket way say everybody for whom this applies will be dealt with in this particular way.
Good. Gentleman over the far side.
Simon Israel, Channel 4 News. On ransoms, Home Secretary, what impact do you think it will have by outlawing British insurance companies from providing cover or reinsurance to the payment of ransoms to terrorist organisations?
Well, what we're doing in this piece of legislation is clarifying the law in relation to the insurance and reinsurance markets in relation to ransom payments. So we're putting beyond doubt what the situation is. So this is a clarification of the law that will make it absolutely clear to people in relation as to what the situation is in relation to ransom payments.
So it's not a new law?
It is. It's clarifying the legal position in relation to this.
Good. Okay. Gentleman at the back.
How quickly do you even get this bill through Parliament? You talk about having broad cross parties support. You can get this through on a fast track mechanism. Can you get it through well into time for any May election?
Yes, I mean the intention obviously is to get this legislation on the statute book well in time before the May election. I'm obviously talking to the opposition about the timetable that we can exercise for this. This won't be emergency legislation as Dripper was, because it's obviously a significant bill in terms of the size of the bill and the number of measures that are within it, so it has to have sufficient time for proper parliamentary consideration of it. But we would see that being on a faster track than one would normally see for a piece of legislation, precisely because the amount of time, apart from anything else, there's the need to get it on the statute book, and of course the amount of time available prior to the Parliament being prorogued in advance of the election is limited.
Good. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. The Home Secretary, has got to go now, but can you join me on behalf of the Institute thanking the Home Secretary for being here today? Thank you.